Now when we implement the product service, we will have to make the HTTP calls to our API, which is the product API. Now whenever we'll be performing any of these 5 operations, we need to create a header, we need to pass a message, retrieve that, convert that to a response DTO. Think about doing same steps for each 5 of the process. It is too much redundancy. How can we reduce that? For that we can implement that generic functionality in another repository or service and then use or inherit that service inside all of the services in our project. That way we will reduce the redundant code, as well as whenever we are sending a request, we know that we only have to debug one place. And in future, if we make change, that will only reside in one location. So we need to implement a generic implementation of sending an API request. Before we do anything with that, we need to create a model that will hold the API request that we will be sending to any of the services like product API. So inside models, we will add a new class file and we want to create a model for API request. Whenever we make an API call, think about what are the values that we will need by default. First is the type of API request, like whether it's a GET, POST, PUT or DELETE. So we'll have public, we will have the API type. We already added an enum inside the static details, so we will add the using statement, and with that we'll call this API type. Then we'll do getter and setter here, and we can also set the default type as API type .get. Next thing is the URL on which we want to send this API. So prop string, we will have the URL followed by the data. If there is anything that needs to be passed in message body, we need to store that and pass that along. So the type here will be object, since we are not sure what exactly will be the type. It will be generic, so we can use object. Lastly, we will have a string object for token. Now tokens we are not using right now because we do not have authentication implemented. But in future, when we have authentication implemented, we will require tokens to be passed to each request so that they can be validated for the request. So the API request model looks good. Let me close that. Then we need to implement the generic method to send the service. Inside the iServices, we will add a new class file. It will be an interface, and I will call that as iBaseService. This will be a public interface, and we'll say it inherits the iDisposable. Then what we will do here is we need a response DTO because that is what we will receive. So this will be response DTO, or we can call this response model, getter and setter. Then we need to create a generic method to send the request. The return type will be generic, so we'll say task T. Method name, let me call this as send async. The type will be T because we are using generics here. And we created a model for sending or storing everything related to an API request. So we will pass that as a parameter to the send async method. So now inside the services, we will implement our interface, which is iBaseService. So the class will be baseService, and this class will implement the interface of iBaseService. We will click on Show Potential Fixes and implement the interface. Let's work on this in the next video.